You think that every grandma made the same Christmas Eve meal. No. From 1920 to 2025, every single generation of Southern grandmas cooked completely different Christmas Eve suppers. Some made meals that stretched one chicken to feed 12 people. Some made dishes from whatever the garden still had in December.
Sally puts a cube, about a square inch, of butter into the top of a double boiler. A little butter finds its way into a great many dishes in this kitchen, not only for flavor, but as a blending agent.
Some made suppers with ingredients that cost pennies. Some made simple food because that's all they could afford during hard times. What they chose to cook reveals who they were. Their Christmas Eve meal is their story. 30 forgotten Christmas Eve meals from Southern grandmas. Each one tells you something about that generation and the South they lived in. Let's start with the number 1. Walk into Grandma Louise's kitchen on Christmas Eve 1952 in coastal Georgia and smell the briny sweetness of fresh oysters simmering in milk. She started by melting 2 tablespoons of butter in her cast-iron pot, then added a quart of fresh shucked oysters with their liquor. She let them cook just until the edges curled, maybe 3 minutes. Then she poured in a quart of whole milk, added a pinch of salt and white pepper, and heated it through without boiling. She served it in her good china bowls with oyster crackers crumbled on top. The whole meal cost about 75 cents and fed 8 people. Every spoonful tasted like the ocean and cream mixed together, warm and comforting. Nobody makes oyster stew for Christmas Eve anymore because fresh oysters became expensive, and most families moved away from the coast where oysters were cheap and plentiful. Stand in Grandma Ruby's Alabama farmhouse on Christmas Eve, 1938, and watch her transform last summer's dried butter beans into Christmas supper. She started the night before, soaking 2 cups of dried butter beans in cold water. Christmas Eve morning, she put them in her big pot with a smoked ham hock, an onion, and enough water to cover everything by 2 inches. She let it simmer on the back of the wood stove all day, adding water when it got low. By supper time, the beans were creamy, and the ham hock had fallen apart into tender pieces. She served it with cornbread and green tomato pickle. The whole meal cost maybe 30 cents because the beans came from her garden and the ham hock was the cheapest cut at the store. It tasted rich and smoky, filling and warm. Nobody makes butter beans and ham hock for Christmas Eve anymore because dried beans feel like poor people food now. Walk into Grandma Essie's Mississippi kitchen on Christmas Eve, 1945, and see her mixing canned salmon into crispy patties. She opened a 14-ounce can of pink salmon, drained it, and picked out all the bones and skin. She mixed it with a beaten egg, half cup of cracker crumbs, a little chopped onion, salt and pepper. She shaped it into 6 flat patties and fried them in bacon grease until they were golden brown on both sides, about 3 minutes per side. She served them on a bed of cheese grits with collard greens on the side. The whole meal cost about 40 cents and fed a family of 6. Each croquette tasted crispy outside and soft inside, salty and fishy in a good way. Nobody makes salmon croquettes for Christmas Eve anymore because canned salmon stopped being considered a special meal when fresh fish became available everywhere. Stand beside Grandma Pearl's Tennessee stove on Christmas Eve 1941 and watch her stretch 1 chicken to feed 12 people. She started by boiling the whole chicken in a big pot with celery, onion, and carrots until the meat fell off the bones, about 2 hours. She pulled out the chicken, picked off all the meat, and put the bones back in the pot to boil another hour for extra flavor. Then she strained the broth, brought it back to a boil, and dropped in rolled-out biscuit dough cut into strips. The dumplings cooked in 15 minutes, puffing up and soaking in the rich broth. She stirred the chicken meat back in and served it in deep bowls. The whole meal cost about 60 cents. It tasted like comfort and home, thick and savory. Nobody makes chicken and dumplings for Christmas Eve anymore because it takes too much time to boil a whole chicken. Walk into Grandma Hattie's South Carolina kitchen on Christmas Eve 1933 and smell fatback rendering in the pot. She started with a pound of dried black-eyed peas she'd soaked overnight. Christmas Eve morning, she put them in her cast-iron pot with a quarter-pound of fatback cut into chunks, an onion, and a dried hot pepper. She added enough water to cover by an inch and let it simmer for 3 hours until the peas were tender and creamy. She served them with cornbread and raw onion slices. The whole meal cost about 20 cents and fed 8 people. Each bite tasted rich and porky, the peas soft and the broth thick. The fatback melted into pure flavor. Nobody makes black-eyed peas with fatback for Christmas Eve anymore because fatback disappeared from most grocery stores and people started thinking of peas as just a New Year's tradition. These weren't fancy meals. They were survival dressed up for Christmas Eve.
Better fix plenty because the stimulating aroma of lamb stew does something exciting to the appetite.
While wealthy families ate roast beef and fancy desserts, Southern grandmas on tight budgets created miracles from nothing. Keep watching because the next 45 meals get even more creative, and some required ingredients you've never heard of. Stand in Grandma Dovie's Kentucky kitchen on Christmas Eve 1928 and watch her make supper from just cornmeal and water. She brought 4 cups of water to a boil with a teaspoon of salt, then slowly whisked in 1 cup of yellow cornmeal, stirring constantly so it wouldn't lump. She cooked it for 20 minutes, stirring every few minutes until it was thick as pudding. She poured it into a loaf pan and let it cool until firm, about an hour. Then she sliced it thick and fried the slices in a little lard until they were crispy and golden on both sides. She served them hot with sorghum syrup drizzled on top. The whole meal cost maybe 10 cents and fed 6 people. It tasted sweet and earthy, crispy outside and creamy inside. Nobody makes fried cornmeal mush for Christmas Eve anymore because cornmeal stopped being considered a main dish. Walk into Grandma Cleora's Georgia kitchen on Christmas Eve 1940 and see her turning the cheapest meat into Christmas supper. She bought 2 pounds of pork neck bones for 15 cents, put them in her big pot, covered them with water, and boiled them for 2 hours until the meat was falling off the bones. She pulled out the bones, let them cool enough to handle, picked off all the meat, and put it back in the broth. Then she added a whole head of cabbage, chopped, and cooked it until it was tender, about 30 minutes. She served it with cornbread for sopping up the broth. The whole meal cost about 25 cents and fed 8 people. It tasted porky and slightly sweet from the cabbage, rich and satisfying. Nobody makes neck bones and cabbage for Christmas Eve anymore because neck bones disappeared from most meat counters. Stand beside Grandma Carrie's Louisiana stove on Christmas Eve 1935 and watch her cook the meal that was supposed to bring good luck. She started with a cup of dried field peas she'd soaked overnight, put them in a pot with a ham hock, covered them with water, and simmered them for an hour until tender. Then she added 2 cups of rice and enough water to cook the rice through about 20 more minutes. She stirred in a chopped onion that she'd fried in a little bacon grease until it was golden. She served it hot with hot sauce on the side. The whole meal cost about 30 cents and fed a family of 6. Every bite tasted smoky and earthy. The rice and peas mixed together perfectly. Nobody makes Hopping John for Christmas Eve anymore because it got pushed to New Year's Day only. Walk into Grandma Beulah's Arkansas kitchen on Christmas Eve 1931 and smell salt pork frying. She sliced a pound of salt pork into 1/4-inch thick pieces and soaked them in cold water for an hour to remove some of the salt. Then she dried them and fried them in a cast-iron skillet until they were crispy and golden, about 4 minutes per side. She took out the pork, left the grease in the pan, and made gravy by stirring in 2 tablespoons of flour and cooking it for a minute. Then she slowly added 2 cups of milk, stirring constantly until it thickened. She served the fried salt pork with the milk gravy poured over biscuits. The whole meal cost about 30 cents and fed 6 people. It tasted salty and rich, the gravy smooth and creamy. Nobody makes fried salt pork for Christmas Eve anymore because salt pork mostly disappeared from stores. Stand in Grandma Opal's Virginia kitchen on Christmas Eve 1937 and watch her make Christmas supper from 5 potatoes. She peeled and diced 5 large potatoes, put them in a pot with a chopped onion, covered them with water, and boiled them until they were falling apart, about 20 minutes. She mashed some of the potatoes right in the pot to thicken it, added a cup of milk, a tablespoon of butter, salt, and pepper. She let it heat through without boiling. She served it with crackers crumbled on top. The whole meal cost about 15 cents and fed a family of 6. Every spoonful tasted creamy and comforting, the onions sweet and soft. The butter made it feel like a special meal, even though it was just potatoes. Nobody makes plain potato soup for Christmas Eve anymore because it seems too simple for a holiday. 10 meals down, 40 more to go. These Southern grandmas knew every trick for making cheap ingredients taste special.
Now, remember to gently fold in the dry ingredients, dear.
Oh, right. Almost forgot that step.
The Depression taught them how to stretch pennies into Christmas Eve suppers. Keep watching because the next meals show you cooking techniques that have completely disappeared from American kitchens. Walk into Grandma Minnie's Mississippi kitchen on Christmas Eve 1934 and see her making supper from cornbread and buttermilk. She mixed 2 cups of cornmeal with a teaspoon of salt, a teaspoon of baking soda, and a cup of pork cracklings she'd saved from making lard. She stirred in enough buttermilk to make a thick batter, about 2 cups. She poured it into her hot cast-iron skillet that she'd greased with lard, and baked it at 425 degrees for 25 minutes until it was golden and crispy on top. She cut it into wedges and served it in bowls with cold buttermilk poured over it. The whole meal cost about 20 cents and fed 6 people. It tasted crunchy and tangy, the cracklings adding rich pork flavor. Nobody eats cornbread and buttermilk for Christmas Eve anymore because drinking buttermilk went out of style. Stand beside Grandma Lucille's Alabama stove on Christmas Eve 1939 and watch her cook the greens she'd picked from her garden that morning. She filled her biggest pot with 2 big bunches of collard greens she'd washed and chopped. She added a ham hock, a dried hot pepper, a tablespoon of sugar, and enough water to cover. She let it simmer for 2 hours until the greens were tender and the pot liquor was rich and flavorful. She served the greens in bowls with plenty of pot liquor and cornbread for sopping. The whole meal cost about 25 cents and fed 8 people. Every bite tasted smoky and slightly bitter in a good way, the pot liquor rich and nourishing. Nobody makes just collard greens for Christmas Eve anymore because greens became a side dish instead of the main meal. Walk into Grandma Odette's New Orleans kitchen on Christmas Eve 1943 and smell red beans cooking all day. She started by soaking a pound of dried red beans overnight. Christmas Eve morning, she put them in her pot with the sausage ends she'd saved from the butcher all month. He gave them away free. A chopped onion, a chopped bell pepper, 2 bay leaves, and cayenne pepper. She covered it with water and let it simmer for 4 hours until the beans were creamy and some had broken down to thicken the pot. She served it over white rice. The whole meal cost about 30 cents and fed 8 people. Each bite tasted rich and spicy, the sausage pieces adding smoky flavor throughout. Nobody uses sausage ends for Christmas Eve anymore because butchers don't give away ends, and beans seem too ordinary for holidays. Stand in Grandma Vera's Tennessee kitchen on Christmas Eve 1930 and watch her make supper from cornmeal and molasses. She mixed 2 cups of cornmeal with a teaspoon of salt and enough boiling water to make a thick dough, about 1½ cups. She let it sit for 10 minutes to swell. Then she shaped it into flat cakes about 3 inches across and ½ an inch thick. She fried them in a little lard in her cast-iron skillet until they were golden brown and crispy on both sides, about 5 minutes per side. She served them hot with molasses drizzled on top and a glass of milk. The whole meal cost about 15 cents and fed 6 people. They tasted crispy outside and dense inside, the molasses making them sweet enough to feel like a treat. Nobody makes fried cornmeal cakes for Christmas Eve anymore because cornmeal became animal feed in most people's minds. Walk into Grandma Eunice's Georgia kitchen on Christmas Eve 1936 and see her cooking the dried lima beans she'd put up last summer. She soaked 2 cups of dried lima beans overnight, then put them in her pot with the ham pieces she'd asked the butcher to save for her, the scraps he trimmed off when cutting ham steaks. She added an onion, covered it all with water, and simmered it for 2 hours until the beans were tender and creamy. She served it with cornbread and sliced tomatoes she'd canned. The whole meal cost about 30 cents and fed 8 people. Every spoonful tasted rich and hammy, the beans buttery and soft. The ham pieces were mostly fat and bone, but they flavored everything. Nobody makes lima beans with ham scraps for Christmas Eve anymore because nobody asks the butcher for scraps, and lima beans fell out of favor completely. 15 Christmas Eve meals that cost less than $1. These weren't recipes from cookbooks. These were survival skills passed down from mothers who'd lived through harder times. Keep watching because the next 35 meals show you exactly how Southern grandmas turned poverty into Christmas celebration. Stand beside Grandma Nora's North Carolina stove on Christmas Eve 1942 and smell sausage cooking. She started by making a batch of buttermilk biscuits from 2 cups of flour, a teaspoon of salt, a teaspoon of baking soda, a tablespoon of lard, and enough buttermilk to make soft dough. She rolled them out, cut them with a jar lid, and baked them for 12 minutes. While they baked, she fried ½ a pound of bulk sausage in her skillet, breaking it into crumbles. She didn't drain the grease. She stirred in 2 tablespoons of flour, let it cook for a minute, then slowly added 2 cups of milk, stirring until it thickened. She served the gravy poured over split biscuits. The whole meal cost about 35 cents and fed 6 people. It tasted rich and peppery, filling and warm. Nobody makes biscuits and gravy for Christmas Eve anymore because it became just breakfast food. Walk into Grandma Zilpha's South Carolina kitchen on Christmas Eve 1932 and see her making supper from her fall harvest. She put 2 pounds of raw peanuts, still in their shells, in a big pot, added a ¼ cup of salt, covered them with water, and boiled them for 4 hours until they were soft. While they cooked, she boiled 6 sweet potatoes in another pot until they were tender, about 30 minutes. She peeled the sweet potatoes and mashed them with a little butter and milk. She served the boiled peanuts in their shells in a bowl and the mashed sweet potatoes on plates. The whole meal cost about 20 cents and fed 6 people. The peanuts tasted salty and soft, completely different from roasted peanuts. The sweet potatoes were naturally sweet and creamy. Nobody makes boiled peanuts and sweet potatoes for Christmas Eve anymore because boiled peanuts disappeared from most of America. Stand in Grandma Bertie's Virginia kitchen on Christmas Eve 1929 and watch her turn windfall apples into Christmas supper. She sliced 6 apples thin, leaving the peels on. She melted 2 tablespoons of lard in her cast-iron skillet, added the apples, a half-cup of sugar, and a sprinkle of cinnamon. She cooked them slowly, stirring occasionally, until they were soft and caramelized, about 20 minutes. She made a batch of biscuits from 2 cups of flour, a teaspoon of salt, a teaspoon of baking soda, a tablespoon of lard, and enough buttermilk to make soft dough. She baked them for 12 minutes. She served the fried apples over split biscuits, warm. The whole meal cost about 15 cents and fed 6 people. It tasted like apple pie filling, sweet and spicy. Nobody makes fried apples and biscuits for Christmas Eve anymore because fruit for supper seems strange now. Walk into Grandma Edna's Arkansas kitchen on Christmas Eve, 1938, and smell pinto beans that have been cooking since morning. She soaked a pound of dried pinto beans overnight, then simmered them all day with a piece of salt pork, an onion, and a dried hot pepper. By evening they were creamy, and the broth was thick. While the beans finished, she peeled and sliced 4 potatoes thin and fried them in lard until they were golden and crispy, about 15 minutes, turning them often. She served the beans in bowls with the fried potatoes on the side and cornbread for sopping up the bean broth. The whole meal cost about 25 cents and fed 8 people. The beans tasted rich and porky, the fried potatoes crispy and salty. Nobody makes pinto beans and fried potatoes for Christmas Eve anymore because it seems too plain for a holiday meal. Stand beside Grandma Hedwig's Kentucky kitchen on Christmas Eve 1944 and watch her make the meal her mother brought from Poland. She cored a head of cabbage and boiled it until the leaves were soft enough to peel off, about 10 minutes. She mixed a pound of ground pork, the cheapest grind, with a cup of cooked rice, a chopped onion, salt and pepper. She put a spoonful of filling on each cabbage leaf, rolled it up, and tucked the ends under. She placed them all in a pot, poured a quart of canned tomatoes over them, and simmered them for an hour. She served them with the tomato sauce, spooned over. The whole meal cost about 40 cents and fed 8 people. They tasted sweet from the cabbage and tangy from the tomatoes, filling and satisfying. Nobody makes cabbage rolls for Christmas Eve anymore because rolling cabbage takes too much time. 20 meals that stretched pennies into Christmas Eve celebration. These Southern grandmas knew poverty, but they refused to let their families feel poor on Christmas Eve. Keep watching because the next 30 meals show you the clever tricks they use to make cheap food taste expensive. Walk into Grandma Alma's Louisiana kitchen on Christmas Eve 1935 and see her using the ham bone she'd saved from last Sunday's dinner. She soaked a pound of dried navy beans overnight, then put them in her pot with the ham bone, a chopped onion, a carrot, a bay leaf, and enough water to cover by 2 inches. She simmered it for 3 hours until the beans were soft and creamy and the meat had fallen off the bone. She picked out the bone and bay leaf, mashed some of the beans against the side of the pot to thicken it, and served it with cornbread. The whole meal cost about 20 cents and fed 8 people. Every spoonful tasted rich and smoky, the beans creamy, and the broth thick. Nobody makes navy bean soup with ham bone for Christmas Eve anymore because nobody saves ham bones. Stand in Grandma Hazel's Georgia kitchen on Christmas Eve 1946 and smell bologna frying. She bought a pound of bologna at the store for 35 cents and sliced it thick, about half an inch. She scored the edges so they wouldn't curl up, then fried each slice in a little lard until the edges were crispy and it was browned on both sides, about 3 minutes per side. While the bologna fried, she scrambled a dozen eggs in the same pan with the bologna grease. She served the fried bologna with the scrambled eggs and biscuits she'd made that morning. The whole meal cost about 50 cents and fed 6 people. The bologna tasted salty and slightly sweet, crispy on the edges. The eggs soaked up all that bologna flavor. Nobody makes fried bologna for Christmas Eve anymore because bologna became kids' lunch meat, not special enough for holidays. Walk into Grandma Cora's Mississippi kitchen on Christmas Eve, 1933, and watch her use every part of the turnips she'd pulled from her garden. She washed a big bunch of turnip greens and chopped them rough. She peeled and diced the turnip roots into chunks. She put them both in a pot with a quarter-pound of fatback cut into pieces, a dried hot pepper, and enough water to cover. She simmered it for an hour and a half until the greens were tender and the turnips were soft. She served it in bowls with cornbread for sopping up the pot liquor. The whole meal cost about 15 cents and fed 8 people. The greens tasted slightly bitter and peppery, the turnip roots sweet and soft, the fatback rich and porky. Nobody makes turnip greens and roots together for Christmas Eve anymore because turnips became just a side dish, and most people don't know the greens are edible. Stand beside Grandma Layla's Alabama stove on Christmas Eve, 1940, and watch her make dressing without turkey. She crumbled up a pan of day-old cornbread into a bowl, added a chopped onion she'd fried in a little butter, some chopped celery, sage, salt, and pepper. She poured in enough chicken broth that she'd made by boiling chicken backs and necks the day before to make it moist but not soupy, about 3 cups. She spread it in a baking pan and baked it at 350 degrees for 40 minutes until the top was crusty and golden. She served it with gravy made from the rest of the chicken broth, thickened with flour. The whole meal cost about 30 cents and fed 8 people. It tasted savory and rich, the crusty top and soft middle perfect together. Nobody makes dressing without meat for Christmas Eve anymore because dressing became a side dish instead of the main meal. Walk into Grandma Betha's South Carolina kitchen on Christmas Eve, 1931, and smell salt herring soaking. She bought salt herring from the barrel at the store, 3 fish for 20 cents. She soaked them in cold water overnight to remove some of the salt, changing the water twice. Christmas Eve, she dried them and fried them in a little lard until they were crispy, about 4 minutes per side. She served them with cheese grits and sliced onions. The whole meal cost about 35 cents and fed 6 people. The herring tasted salty and fishy in a strong way, the crispy skin the best part. The grits helped balance the salt. The raw onions added crunch and bite. Nobody makes salt herring for Christmas Eve anymore because salt herring disappeared from most stores and the strong fish taste went out of style completely. Stand in Grandma Della's Arkansas kitchen on Christmas Eve, 1928, and watch her make gravy from pork cracklings. She had a jar of cracklings she'd saved from making lard last month. She put a cup of cracklings in her cast-iron skillet and heated them until the fat started to render out. She stirred in 2 tablespoons of flour and let it cook for a minute, then slowly added 2 cups of milk, stirring constantly until it thickened into gravy. She made biscuits from 2 cups of flour, a teaspoon of salt, a teaspoon of baking soda, a tablespoon of lard, and enough buttermilk to make soft dough. Walk into Grandma Birdie's Tennessee kitchen on Christmas Eve, 1934, and see her opening cans of hominy. She opened 3 cans of white hominy and heated them in a pot with a little butter. While they heated, she fried 4 slices of country ham in her cast-iron skillet until they were browned on both sides. She took out the ham and poured a cup of strong black coffee into the hot ham grease, stirring and scraping up all the brown bits from the bottom of the pan. She let it boil for a minute. She served the hominy on plates with a slice of ham and the red-eye gravy poured over everything, with biscuits on the side. Stand beside Grandma Eula's Georgia stove on Christmas Eve, 1930, and watch her make hash from sowbelly and sweet potatoes. She diced a pound of sowbelly, salt pork from the pig's belly, into small cubes and fried it in her cast-iron skillet until it was crispy and all the fat had rendered out about 10 minutes. She didn't drain the grease. She added 4 peeled and diced sweet potatoes and a chopped onion to the pan. She cooked it all together, stirring occasionally until the sweet potatoes were tender and browned about 20 minutes. Walk into Grandma Zora's Mississippi kitchen on Christmas Eve, 1937, and smell field peas cooking. She soaked a pound of dried field peas overnight, then put them in her pot with a ham hock, covered them with water, and simmered them for 2 hours until they were soft enough to mash. She mashed about half the peas against the side of the pot to thicken the soup, then stirred in a chopped onion that she'd fried in a little bacon grease. She served it in bowls with pepper vinegar on the table for everyone to add to their own bowl. She made the pepper vinegar by putting hot peppers in a jar of vinegar months ago. The whole meal cost about 20 cents and fed 8 people. Each spoonful tasted earthy and rich, the pepper vinegar adding heat and tang. Nobody makes field pea soup for Christmas Eve anymore because field peas became just animal feed. Stand in Grandma Winnie's North Carolina kitchen on Christmas Eve, 1932, and watch her fry side meat. She bought a pound of side meat, the fatty part of the pig's side, for 20 cents and sliced it thick. She fried it in her cast-iron skillet until it was crispy and golden, about 5 minutes per side. She took out the meat and kept it warm. In the same grease, she fried sliced apples with a little sugar until they were soft and caramelized. About 15 minutes. She served the fried side meat with the fried apples and biscuits. The whole meal cost about 30 cents and fed 6 people. The side meat tasted crispy and salty and rich, mostly fat with streaks of lean meat. The sweet fried apples balanced the salty meat perfectly. Nobody makes side meat with fried apples for Christmas Eve anymore because side meat disappeared from stores, and the combination seems odd now. 30. Christmas Eve meals from Southern grandmas who refused to let poverty define their holidays. Every meal stretched cheap ingredients into something that felt special. Keep watching because the next 20 meals show you the most creative poverty cooking you've ever seen. These grandmas were artists. Walk into Grandma Vesta's Kentucky kitchen on Christmas Eve 1929 and see her cooking dried corn she'd put up last summer. She had dried field corn kernels that she'd cut off the cob and dried in the sun. She soaked 2 cups of dried corn in water overnight. Christmas Eve morning, she put the corn in her pot with a ham hock, an onion, and enough water to cover. She simmered it for 4 hours until the corn was tender and swelled up. The soup thickened naturally from the corn starch. She served it in bowls with cornbread. The whole meal cost about 15 cents and fed 8 people. Every spoonful tasted sweet and smoky, the corn chewy and the broth milky. The ham hock added rich pork flavor throughout. Nobody makes dried field corn soup for Christmas Eve anymore because nobody dries field corn at home, and the texture seems too chewy for modern tastes. Stand beside Grandma Iva's Alabama stove on Christmas Eve 1936 and watch her cook butter beans with streak-o lean. She soaked 2 cups of dried butter beans overnight, then put them in her pot with a half-pound of streak-o lean, salt pork with alternating streaks of fat and lean meat, an onion, and enough water to cover. She simmered it for 2 hours until the beans were creamy and tender. She served it with cornbread and sliced tomatoes. The whole meal cost about 30 cents and fed 8 people. Each bite tasted rich and porky. The butter beans, soft and buttery. The streak-o lean fell apart into the beans, flavoring everything. Nobody makes butter beans with streak-o lean for Christmas Eve anymore because streak-o lean disappeared from meat counters and butter beans became unfashionable, replaced by more exotic beans. Stand in Grandma Letty's Virginia kitchen on Christmas Eve 1938 and watch her cook the rabbit her husband shot that morning. She cut the rabbit into pieces and browned them in a little lard in her cast-iron pot. She added a chopped onion, a chopped carrot, a diced potato, salt, pepper, and enough water to cover. She simmered it for an hour and a half until the rabbit was tender. Then she made drop dumplings by mixing a cup of flour with a teaspoon of baking powder, a pinch of salt, and enough milk to make thick batter. She dropped spoonfuls of batter into the simmering stew, covered it, and cooked for 15 minutes without lifting the lid. The whole meal cost about 10 cents. Just the vegetables, and fed 6 people. It tasted rich and gamey, the rabbit tender and the dumplings fluffy. Nobody makes rabbit stew for Christmas Eve anymore because most people don't hunt rabbit, and rabbit meat seems strange now. Walk into Grandma Maudie's Tennessee kitchen on Christmas Eve 1931 and see her cooking greens she gathered from the woods. She picked young poke leaves that morning before they got too big and bitter, washed them 3 times, and boiled them in 3 changes of water to remove the bitterness and toxins. After the 3rd boiling, she drained them and chopped them. She fried them in bacon grease with a chopped onion until they were tender, about 10 minutes. Then she scrambled 6 eggs right in with the greens. She served it with cornbread. The whole meal cost about 20 cents. Just the eggs and cornbread ingredients, and fed 6 people. It tasted earthy and slightly bitter, the eggs making it rich and substantial. Nobody makes poke salad for Christmas Eve anymore because most people don't know how to identify poke plants, and the poisonous risk scares everyone away. 35 meals down, 15 to go. These southern grandmas knew every trick for making nothing into something. They gathered wild foods, stretched meat with grains, and transformed the cheapest cuts into Christmas Eve celebration. The final 15 meals are the most creative poverty meals you've ever heard of. Stand beside Grandma Tessie's Mississippi kitchen on Christmas Eve 1934 and smell chitterlings cooking. She bought 5 pounds of hog chitterlings from the butcher for 30 cents. The intestines nobody else wanted. She cleaned them thoroughly, turning them inside out and scraping away everything, washing them in multiple changes of water, taking 3 hours just to clean them. Then she cut them into pieces, put them in her pot with an onion and a dried hot pepper, covered them with water, and simmered them for 4 hours until they were tender. She served them in bowls with hot vinegar and hot sauce on the side, with cornbread. The whole meal cost about 40 cents and fed 8 people. They tasted strong and rich and slightly funky, the texture chewy. The vinegar was essential to cut the richness. Nobody makes chitterlings for Christmas Eve anymore because the smell during cooking is so strong. Walk into Grandma Essie's Georgia kitchen on Christmas Eve 1927 and watch her make Christmas supper from pancake. She mixed 2 cups of cornmeal with a teaspoon of salt, a teaspoon of baking soda, and enough buttermilk to make pourable batter, about 2 cups. She heated her griddle, greased it with a little lard, and poured circles of batter. She cooked them until bubbles formed on top. About 3 minutes, then flipped them and cooked another 2 minutes. She made a big stack. She served them hot with sorghum syrup drizzled on top. The whole meal cost about 20 cents and fed 6 people. They tasted slightly sweet and grainy from the cornmeal, crispy on the edges. The sorghum added dark, molasses-like sweetness. Nobody makes cornmeal pancakes for Christmas Eve anymore because cornmeal pancakes became old-fashioned and sorghum syrup disappeared from most stores, replaced by maple syrup. Stand in Grandma Rhoda's Kentucky kitchen on Christmas Eve 1935 and see her cooking the leather breeches she'd hung to dry last summer. She had green beans she'd strung on thread and dried in the sun until they looked like brown leather strips. She soaked a big handful of dried beans in water overnight. Christmas Eve morning, she put them in her pot with a 1/4 pound of fatback, covered them with water, and simmered them for 3 hours until they were tender. The beans turned from brown back to green as they cooked. She served them with cornbread. The whole meal cost about 20 cents and fed 6 people. They tasted smoky and rich, completely different from fresh green beans, almost meaty in texture. Nobody makes shucky beans for Christmas Eve anymore because nobody dries green beans on strings, and the strong flavor went out of style. Walk into Grandma Odessa's North Carolina kitchen on Christmas Eve, 1930, and watch her make supper from cornmeal mush. She made mush the night before by cooking 2 cups of cornmeal in 6 cups of boiling water with salt until it was thick as pudding, about 20 minutes. She poured it into a loaf pan and let it cool overnight until it was firm. Christmas Eve, she sliced it thick and fried the slices in lard until they were golden and crispy on both sides. While they fried, she made gravy by frying a chopped onion in bacon grease, adding a quart of canned tomatoes, and simmering it for 15 minutes. She served the fried mush with the tomato gravy poured over. The whole meal cost about 20 cents and fed 6 people. It tasted crispy and creamy at the same time, the tomato gravy tangy and sweet. Nobody makes fried mush with tomato gravy for Christmas Eve anymore because it seems too much like prison food. Stand beside Grandma Verley's Louisiana kitchen on Christmas Eve, 1933, and see her slicing souse meat. She'd made souse meat the week before by boiling a pig's head until all the meat fell off, picking out the bones, chopping the meat fine, mixing it with vinegar, spices, and onions, and pressing it into a loaf pan until it set firm. Christmas Eve, she sliced it thin and served it cold with saltine crackers and sliced onions. The whole meal cost about 30 cents and fed 6 people. It tasted tangy and rich, the vinegar cutting through the fatty pork. The texture was soft and a little gelatinous from all the natural gelatin in the pig's head. Nobody makes souse meat for Christmas Eve anymore because nobody wants to boil a pig's head, and the word souse sounds disgusting to modern ears. 40. Christmas Eve meals that most people today wouldn't recognize as food. These southern grandmas used every part of the animal, every wild plant, every preservation technique to create Christmas Eve celebration from nothing. The final 10 meals are the ones their granddaughters refuse to learn how to make. Walk into Grandma Virgie's Alabama kitchen on Christmas Eve, 1932, and see her serving the head cheese she'd made 3 days ago. She'd started by getting a whole hog's head from the butcher, split in half for almost nothing because nobody wanted it. She scrubbed it clean, put both halves in her biggest pot, covered them with water, added salt, peppercorns, bay leaves, and onions. She boiled it for 6 hours until every bit of meat was tender and falling off the skull bones. The kitchen smelled like boiling pork for days. She let it cool just enough to handle, then picked every bit of meat off the bones, including the tongue and the cheeks. She chopped all the meat fine, mixed it with the strained cooking liquid that had gelatin from the skull bones, added vinegar and hot peppers, and poured it into loaf pans. She let it chill overnight until the gelatin set it firm as lunch meat. Christmas Eve, she sliced it thin and served it cold with saltine crackers, pickled beets, and pickled onions. The whole meal cost about 40 cents and fed 10 people. It tasted rich and porky and tangy from the vinegar, the gelatin giving it a smooth, sliceable texture. The pickles added crunch and sharp flavor. Nobody makes hog's head cheese for Christmas Eve anymore because boiling a hog's head seems barbaric, and the idea of eating anything from a head disgusts most modern people completely. Stand beside Grandma Cleo's Arkansas stove on Christmas Eve, 1929, and watch her cook the 3 squirrels her son shot that morning. She cut each squirrel into pieces like you'd cut a chicken. She dredged the pieces in flour, seasoned with salt and pepper, then fried them in lard in her cast-iron skillet until they were golden brown on all sides, about 15 minutes total. She took out the squirrel pieces and kept them warm. In the same skillet, with all that good brown squirrel flavor in the grease, she made gravy. She stirred in 3 tablespoons of flour and cooked it for a minute until it browned. Then she slowly added 2 cups of milk, stirring constantly, scraping up all the brown bits from the bottom of the pan. She stirred until the gravy thickened, about 5 minutes. She seasoned it with more salt and pepper. She made biscuits from 2 cups of flour, a teaspoon of salt, a teaspoon of baking soda, 2 tablespoons of lard, and enough buttermilk to make soft dough. She rolled them out, cut them with a jar lid, and baked them for 12 minutes at 450 degrees. She served the fried squirrel pieces with the gravy poured over split biscuits. The whole meal cost nothing but the flour and buttermilk, maybe 15 cents, and fed 6 people. The squirrel tasted gamey and rich, darker and stronger than chicken. The little pieces of meat were tender if you knew how to avoid the many tiny bones. The gravy made everything rich and comforting. Nobody makes squirrel gravy for Christmas Eve anymore because most people don't hunt squirrels, and the idea of eating squirrel seems primitive and wrong. Walk into Grandma Bessie's Mississippi kitchen on Christmas Eve, 1936, and smell cracklin' cornbread baking and greens cooking. She started the greens in the morning. She filled her biggest pot with turnip greens she'd picked from her garden, added a ham hock, a dried hot pepper, and a tablespoon of sugar. She covered it with water and let it simmer for 3 hours until the greens were tender and the cooking liquid, pot liquor, was rich and flavorful. While the greens cooked, she made cracklin' cornbread. She mixed 2 cups of cornmeal with a teaspoon of salt, a teaspoon of baking soda, and a cup of pork cracklings, the crispy bits left after rendering lard. She stirred in enough buttermilk to make thick batter, about 1½ cups. She poured it into a cast-iron skillet that she'd preheated with lard until it was smoking hot. She baked it at 425 degrees for 25 minutes until it was golden brown with crispy edges. She served the greens on plates with plenty of pot liquor poured over them. She served the cornbread on the side, still hot from the oven. The whole meal cost about 25 cents and fed 8 people. The greens tasted smoky and slightly bitter, the pot liquor rich and nourishing, almost like meat broth. The cracklin' cornbread tasted crunchy from the cracklings, savory and rich. You dipped the cornbread in the pot liquor, letting it soak up all that flavor. Nobody makes pot liquor and cracklin' cornbread for Christmas Eve anymore because drinking pot liquor seems too poor, and most people don't know what cracklings are or how to make them. Stand in Grandma Pearl's Georgia kitchen on Christmas Eve, 1931, and smell salt mackerel soaking. She bought 2 salt mackerel from the barrel at the general store for 25 cents. They were stiff as boards from the salt. She soaked them in cold water overnight, changing the water 3 times to draw out some of the salt. Christmas Eve morning she dried them and broke them into pieces, picking out the bones. She fried the pieces in a little lard until they were crispy and golden, about 5 minutes. While the fish fried, she made Johnny cakes. She mixed 2 cups of cornmeal with a teaspoon of salt and enough boiling water to make thick batter that would hold together, about 1½ cups. She shaped it into flat cakes about 3 inches across. She fried them in the same pan with the fish grease until they were golden and crispy on both sides, about 4 minutes per side. She served the fried salt mackerel with the Johnny cakes and sliced raw onions. The whole meal cost about 35 cents and fed 6 people. The mackerel tasted intensely salty and fishy, the crispy skin the best part. The Johnny cakes were bland and helped balance the salt. The raw onions added bite and freshness. Nobody makes salt mackerel and Johnny cakes for Christmas Eve anymore because salt mackerel disappeared from stores and the strong fish taste became unacceptable. Also, Johnny cakes, journey cakes, went completely out of style, replaced by cornbread that's baked instead of fried. Walk into Grandma Lessie's South Carolina kitchen on Christmas Eve, 1937, and smell chitterlings boiling. She'd spent half the day cleaning 5 pounds of hog intestines, turning them inside out over a broomstick handle, scraping away everything inside, washing them in multiple changes of water with vinegar and salt. The cleaning took longer than the cooking. After they were finally clean, she cut them into 2-inch pieces and put them in her pot with 2 onions, a green bell pepper, garlic, bay leaves, and hot peppers. She covered them with water and simmered them for 5 hours until they were tender enough to chew. The smell filled the whole house, strong and funky and unmistakable. While they cooked, she made a big pot of white rice. When everything was done, she served the chitlins over rice with the cooking liquid ladled over everything. She put hot sauce and vinegar on the table for everyone to add to their own bowl. The whole meal cost about 45 cents and fed 10 people. The chitlins tasted rich and strong, the texture chewy but tender, the flavor funky and porky. You needed the vinegar and hot sauce to cut through the richness. The rice soaked up all the flavorful cooking liquid. Nobody makes chitlins over rice for Christmas Eve anymore because the smell during cooking is so overwhelming that it gets in everything in the house, and cleaning chitlins is such hard, disgusting work that nobody wants to do it. Also, the strong flavor and chewy texture became completely unacceptable to modern tastes. Stand beside Grandma Myrtle's Louisiana kitchen on Christmas Eve, 1928, and watch her prepare the opossum her husband caught in a trap. She'd kept the opossum in a cage for a week, feeding it corn and apples to clean out its system. Opossums eat garbage and carrion, so you had to clean them out first. Christmas Eve morning, she killed it, cleaned it like you'd clean a chicken, and scrubbed the skin. She parboiled the whole opossum in salted water for 30 minutes to remove the wild taste. Then she dried it, rubbed it with lard, salt, and pepper, and placed it in her roasting pan. She peeled 6 sweet potatoes and arranged them around the opossum. She roasted everything at 350 degrees for 2.5 hours, basting every 30 minutes with the drippings until the opossum was tender and the sweet potatoes were caramelized. She served it on a platter with the sweet potatoes arranged around it, the dark meat and crispy skin glistening. The whole meal cost nothing but the sweet potatoes, maybe 10 cents, and fed 6 people. The opossum tasted dark and rich, somewhere between pork and wild game, very fatty. The sweet potatoes cooked in the drippings were sweet and savory at the same time. Nobody makes opossum for Christmas Eve anymore because the idea of eating opossum, which we now call roadkill, disgusts modern people, and it's illegal to trap them in most places. Also, the week-long preparation of feeding them to clean them out is too much work for anyone today. Walk into Grandma Dovey's Arkansas kitchen on Christmas Eve, 1934, and smell hog jowl frying. She'd bought a hog jowl, the pig's cheek, from the butcher for 20 cents. It was mostly fat with streaks of lean meat. She sliced it thick and fried it in her cast-iron skillet until it was crispy and golden, and all the fat had rendered out. About 10 minutes per side. While the jowl cooked, she cooked dried field peas that she'd soaked overnight. She put them in a pot with the jowl drippings, an onion, and enough water to cover. She simmered them for 1.5 hours until they were tender and creamy. She mashed some of the peas against the side of the pot to thicken the liquid into a gravy. She served the fried jowl bacon with the field peas ladled alongside and cornbread for sopping. The whole meal cost about 35 cents and fed 8 people. The jowl tasted incredibly rich and fatty, crispy on the outside, the lean streaks tender and flavorful. The field peas were earthy and rich from cooking in the jowl drippings. Nobody makes hog jowl for Christmas Eve anymore because jowl bacon disappeared from most meat counters and the extreme fattiness became unacceptable. Most people today have never heard of eating pig cheeks, and the idea sounds disgusting. Also, field peas became animal feed in most people's minds. Fried hams, pork jowl. Stand in Grandma Carrie's Tennessee kitchen on Christmas Eve, 1930, and watch her make what poor people called country ham, even though it wasn't ham at all. She had a piece of cured pork jowl, pig's cheek, that had been salt-cured and smoked like ham. She sliced it thin and fried the slices in her cast-iron skillet until they were browned on both sides, and the fat had rendered out, about 3 minutes per side. She took out the meat and kept it warm. In the hot grease, she poured a cup of strong black coffee, stirring and scraping up all the brown bits from the bottom of the pan. She let it boil hard for 2 minutes until it reduced slightly and turned reddish-brown. That was red-eye gravy, named for the circle of fat that floats on top that looks like an eye. She cooked grits in salted water until they were thick and creamy, about 20 minutes. She served the fried jowl with the red-eye gravy poured over grits on the side. The whole meal cost about 30 cents and fed 6 people. The jowl tasted salty and smoky like ham, but fattier. The red-eye gravy tasted bitter and salty and rich, unlike anything else. The grits soaked up the gravy. Nobody makes jowl and red-eye gravy for Christmas Eve anymore because pork jowl disappeared from stores. Red-eye gravy seems too bitter and strange for modern tastes, and the name jowl disgusts people who don't want to think about eating pig cheeks. Walk into Grandma Zula's Mississippi kitchen on Christmas Eve 1927 and watch her make Christmas supper from cornbread and buttermilk. She made cracklin' bread by mixing 2 cups of cornmeal with a teaspoon of salt, a teaspoon of baking soda, and a cup of pork cracklings, the crispy bits left after rendering lard into fat. She stirred in enough buttermilk to make thick batter, about 1½ cups. She poured it into her hot cast-iron skillet that she'd greased with lard and baked it at 425 degrees for 25 minutes until it was golden with crispy edges. When the bread was done, she let it cool for 10 minutes, then crumbled it into bowls. She poured cold buttermilk over the crumbled cornbread until it was soupy. She put chopped raw onions on the table for people to add to their bowls if they wanted. The whole meal cost about 20 cents and fed 6 people as their entire Christmas Eve supper. It tasted tangy and rich, the cracklings adding savory pork flavor, the buttermilk cold and thick. You ate it with a spoon, the cornbread soaking up the buttermilk. Nobody makes cracklin' bread and buttermilk soup for Christmas Eve anymore because eating cornbread and buttermilk seems like depression food, which it was. And most people today have never drunk buttermilk and think it sounds disgusting. Also, cracklings disappeared when people stopped rendering their own lard, and the whole concept of cold soup made from crumbled bread offends modern ideas of what a proper meal should be. Walk into Grandma Izora's Georgia kitchen on Christmas Eve 1926 and watch her make the simplest Christmas Eve supper possible. She had a ½ pound of fatback, pure pork fat with maybe a tiny streak of lean meat, that cost 15 cents. She sliced it thick and fried it in her cast-iron skillet until it was golden brown and crispy on the outside, but still soft on the inside, about 6 minutes per side. Most of the fat rendered out into the pan as it cooked. She made a pan of cornbread by mixing 2 cups of cornmeal with a teaspoon of salt, a teaspoon of baking soda, and enough buttermilk to make thick batter. She poured it into her hot skillet, after pouring out most of the rendered fat, and baked it for 20 minutes. She served each person a piece of fried fatback on a square of hot cornbread, with molasses drizzled over everything. The whole meal cost about 25 cents and fed 6 people. The fatback tasted rich and porky, mostly fat, crispy on the outside. The molasses added dark sweetness. The cornbread soaked up the fat and molasses. Nobody makes fatback and molasses over cornbread for Christmas Eve anymore because fatback disappeared from most stores. Eating pure pork fat became unacceptable, and the combination of meat and molasses seems completely wrong to modern tastes. This was poverty food at its most basic, and it shows exactly how far Southern grandmas would stretch 25 cents that cost almost nothing and that transformed dry bread or potatoes into something approaching a meal. This desperate creation cost about 2 cents and demonstrated what mothers did when poverty eliminated even basic ingredients like milk. Mothers made water gravy by creating roux from flour and bacon grease or other saved fat, cooking it until golden, then gradually adding water while stirring constantly to prevent lumps. The gravy thickened as it cooked, creating sauce that was thinner and less rich than milk gravy, but that was better than nothing. The gravy's flavor came entirely from the fat and from careful browning of the flour. There was no milk or meat to provide richness or complexity. Mothers learned to brown the flour carefully, understanding that proper browning created flavor that partially compensated for the lack of milk and meat. The gravy was served over bread, potatoes, or biscuits, creating meal that was filling, if not particularly satisfying. The gravy provided moisture that made dry food easier to eat and created impression of more substantial meal than plain bread or potatoes alone would provide. To give their families something on Christmas Eve, 50 Christmas Eve meals from Southern grandmas who lived on tight budgets. Every single one of these meals cost less than $1. Most cost less than 50 cents. Some cost less than a quarter. None of them came from cookbooks. They came from mothers teaching daughters how to survive, how to stretch pennies, how to create celebration from nothing.